Hello and welcome back to all 1,330 plus of you avid consumers of Pax Day and Pax Day related content. I'm Eltari, the professional gamer, and today we have lore to talk about. It's one of my favorite topics to cover on this channel just because it is such an interesting lore that Pax Day has. And today, in our Friday post that we got from the developers over at Mainframe, we got a very large and extensive lore manuscript to go over. And that is exactly what we are going to do. There are some obvious gameplay implications. Some of this stuff we even saw in Alpha 1. So I was going to touch on all of those and a little bit more than that, and a little postulation for what's going to come in the following weeks. I know a lot of us were hoping that we would get an Alpha 2 date. That did not happen today. I have a feeling it's going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. But all of that being said, welcome. This is another Pax Friday review, the show where we talk about all of the fun, interesting, new, and exciting information that has dropped for Pax Day over the last week. If you haven't done so already, be sure to like, subscribe, so that you can get notified whenever we come out with new videos, especially the ones related to Pax Day. And let's go ahead and get into some lore. All right, so let's make an attempt at some Old English here. If thou beest he, but oh, how fallen, how changed from him, who in the happy realms of light, clothed with transcendent brightness, didst outshine myriads through bright something. This is a small bit of the lore that we got from today's Friday information dump, and a lot of the information is pertaining to Zebians. Now, we've covered Zebians in the past. There's been a couple of lore posts covering the cultists of Zeb, I guess is what we can call them. And the first post that we got was more so in relation to a very particular Zebian who was trying to pave the way for a duke of the cult known as Duke Lamelin. And that was the story, I guess, of Gatekeeper Montel. Now, this post is a lot less to do with a very specific or particular individual, and a lot more to do with just the Zebians as a whole. And I feel like this is an interesting thing to talk about because there's a couple of dungeon names that are actually mentioned in this post, and it gives a little bit more context as to what they are, as well as what we might find in them. So let's go ahead and talk about it and find out what we can uncover. All right, and really quickly as well, something I just wanted to mention, because most of this post is going to be about Zebians. Something I found quite interesting at the very, very start of this lore post was actually that it is describing the first creation, and then describing that something was described from the first creation. So it says, thus was described at the end of the first creation, as the original paradise was lost, this prince of hell, manifest gluttony, and devourer of lands, the lord of flies himself, ruler of the nightmare, and its various manifestations on this side of the veil. That is a lot to unpack, but the important part that I just wanted to reference and think about is that it is something that is being described at the end of the first creation. So we know that in Pax Day lore, there have been several creations, and they've all been kind of layered on top of each other as they've failed. And the divine has come in and replaced them with a new creation on top of the old one. And this indicates that there's at least been some form of communication, either through text-based mechanisms like books or manuscripts or something like that. But there's some kind of way that the different creations have been able to communicate with one another in regards to what existed previously and what exists now. So that means that we as players are going to be able to uncover some of these things and really start to piece out how different levels of creation both succeeded and failed. And it'll also be nice to be able to get maybe some more magical related artifacts from those as well. But now moving on to the bulk of what we're going to be talking about for today, and that is the cultists, and specifically the Zebians. So the Dukes of Zeb are kind of the demon overlords of this cult, known as Cult of Zeb. And the cultists are those who follow these dukes. And what they're really trying to do is prep the way for them to cross over. There seems to be some kind of dynamic with the more powerful entities of the Cult of Zeb, and that is the dukes need to gather a certain amount of power in order to be able to make their way across the veil into this current iteration of creation. I believe that means that they are all technically coming from possibly even the first layer, and they are breaking through and making their way into the world. But the cultists are essentially working actively towards bringing those individuals to the current plane of creation. And one of those seems to be the Duke of Lamelin. That's what Gatekeeper Montel was working towards and trying to create the environment for Duke Lamelin to get into the actual world. But it sounds like this might be something where we as players, when we're going into these dungeons, it kind of explains possibly even a layer of when a boss that we have to go and kill actually spawns in, and how that dynamic works. So this is leading me in the direction that we're going to be getting a lot more of this developed and weeded out in the future in terms of a gameplay oriented thing. But then we also got into a couple of the names of the dungeons, and we know these names existed because when you pressed M in Alpha 1 you were inside of a dungeon, you'd actually be able to see the name of the dungeon. So a couple of those were the Molting Chamber, the Contagium, and the Absterium, as well as there are a couple of these different ones called Zebians, and hopefully I'm pronouncing all of those correctly. But it was cool in this particular case to actually see what all of those meant and what types of things were relating to those particular dungeons. So the Molting Chamber, I believe I went to that one in Alpha 1, if I recall correctly, and now some bits and pieces actually make sense, where the Molting Chambers is a place where insects hatch from. So in this particular circumstance, apparently how the cultists of Zeb utilize their less strong members is they put them into these giant caskets, and that's where they allow insects to feed off of their corpses and then breed into lots of flies. Pretty gross. But that explains why when we're in the dungeons, we would see all of these different caskets that would be around, and they look like they've been broken out of in a way. And I thought it had more to do with maybe that's how people become Zebians, but it actually sounds more like that is how the insects that we see kind of profuse around the entire dungeon come out. And another interesting aspect as well is when you go into these dungeons, there's actually an entrance, and I think I have gameplay footage, which I'll be showing in the background here, but there's these worm-like carrion style statues that are kind of entering as you're going into an actual dungeon. So I find that interesting that there's this bug insect kind of motif with the cultists of Zeb. And that kind of all plays into the molting chamber kind of name as well. Then we have the contagium, which is where pigs are corrupted. Apparently the cultists really like pigs, and I think that might have to do with some of the fly-ridden and infested boars that we've seen scattered throughout Pax Dei up until this point. Then you have the Absterium, which is where a lot of demonic relics that have existed will be found. So that's going to probably be one where, we recall from last week, all of the screenshots that we got, there were relics that were visible and that we could see. So maybe we'll be able to go and find those in places like the Absterium, which would be really cool. And then the kind of last one were these Zebians. Now, the Zebians were described as a place where the dukes or some of their more higher ups, as well as cultists, might be hanging out and around. And those ones are definitely going to be places where we will find potentially some really difficult people to fight and potentially get some good loot from as well. So all of those things together kind of sum up a lot of what we learned from today's lore post. And there is a lot of additional information that I'm gonna save for another video where we're gonna just talk completely about Zebians, where they came from, and what we know about them so far. But until we did that, I just wanted to cover all of it since it is Friday, and I wanted to cover this as it was something that is new and posted for it. But one last thing that I did want to mention with the post as well is there has been some questions in the community about whether or not Sethians and Zebians are connected in some way, shape, or form. And I think that this particular lore post has really put to bed any types of thoughts that the Sethians would ever be really working with the Zebians. And the reason why I say that is because there's a particular section in this where it talks about, while there is still those who have fallen in the wicked ways of heresy, they still worship the true Lord, albeit not in the correct manner. So the cultists, however, are clearly stated as they are in it completely for themselves. It's entirely selfish, as is with most demonic cults. And that is a very primary distinction between Zebians and Sethians. Sethians are actually still trying to worship the divine, it sounds like. The only difference is that they are just choosing the incorrect way to do so, at least from the perspective of this author. And the Zebians are just complete abominations of creation. They are not there to worship the divine. They are worshiping themselves. They are worshiping gluttony. They're worshiping consuming all and everything, but never being satisfied. Other than that, that is all of the information that we have for this week. We also got this great screenshot, which I've been showing in the background here as well, of part of the dungeon. But I think that we are getting really, really close to an Alpha 2 announcement. I know the end of Q1 is coming up in about 2 weeks. So we should be getting some information in the next 2 to 3 weeks about when we will get into Alpha 2. And then we also have early access coming up later this year. So if you enjoy this type of content, let me know down below. We will be having a video covering a lot more of the lore of the Zebians, but this is just kind of more of an overview for today. If you like this stuff, please do like, subscribe, so that you can get notified whenever we come out with more videos. And as always, I'm Altari, the Professional Gamer. See you next week.